I'm going to turn it on, right? That's important because if you can't hear it, then the video looks kind of strange. So today we begin with Paul.
Is it on?
Yeah. Oh no, not that microphone. This one. We got it. We got it. Deacon Paul is thinking too hard. He's too good at what he does. So we're starting with Paul in northern Greece. And he was in Philippi last time. And he leaves Philippi and he travels to Thessalonica. Why does he go there? Well, partially because he's chased out of Philippi, but why else? Why there?
Synagogue.
The synagogue. That seemed to be the common answer for a lot of people, and I would suggest to you that it's not that. Anyone else want to venture a guess as to why? You have to think much more simply. It's they follow the road. They follow the road. You have to remember that in the ancient world there aren't all that many roads. And at this point in time, remember, cities have walls around them quite often to protect them from bandits. They close the gates at night. But the major Roman roads had the feature of having guard posts every so many miles. And if you were bandits, you didn't want to meet a gang of grouchy Roman soldiers, or you might end up on the short end of a sharp stick. And so, like, sometimes, I mean, it could be because there's a synagogue, and there's lots of reasons. Thessalonica was a major economic center of that part of Greece. It still is. I think it's the second largest city in Greece today. But it's, sometimes things also happen, like, why did they go there? Because it was the port, and if you got on a boat here, this is where you went. Why did they go to the next town? Because it was down the road. And it's just important to remember that sometimes things are very earthy and simple like that. They're not always complicated. In this case, they were following the road. And we know they were following the road because of something the text tells us. What was that?
The name of that road?
The name of the road. The text of the Bible doesn't give us the name of the road. Our commentary did. But the text of the Bible tells us something that gives us a clue.
The cities they passed through.
Yes, the cities they passed through on the way. You got it. So we know that they were following the road because the road went through these cities, and it's just like going down the map. Like if you're traveling from Bismarck to Fargo, you know, if you say, well, I was in Bismarck and then in Sterling and then in Steele, the next major town is Jamestown. And then, you know, you can go off to the east. And so if you were telling a story and you talked about being in those towns, you could guess that the person is traveling on I-94 because that's where it goes. You know, sometimes you can go overland, but even now, how many of you decide to do that? Like, oh, I want to go to Craigness, which is north of Moorhead. And I'm just going to, you know, turn into a field and drive, and I'll get there eventually because I know it's this direction. None of you are shaking your head like you do that. Even if you're already across the river. Then what? You still don't drive straight there, do you? So sometimes it's just important to remember that there can be very, very earthly reasons why things happen. And actually, Roman roads are a major part of how Christianity was able to spread. Like, this was a big deal in the early world because they made these roads. And I put a picture of this Via Egnatia, something like that, it happened on the next page. It's hard to get the pictures to line up where you want them to because they move around as you add more questions at the beginning. But some of the Roman roads are still used today. Romans were really, really good engineers. The Greeks weren't. The Greeks were great artisans. They carved statues and that kind of stuff. But no one lauds the glories of Greek roads. You've never heard of it. But there's portions of Roman roads that are actually still in use. They were good at what they did. Roman cement was quite strong. It was mixed with a secret ingredient. Anyone know their secret ingredient? This took a long time for modern people to figure out.
Salt water.
Yes, seawater. They were like, how is this cement so good? And yada, 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 yada. Well, it turns out if you mix seawater with a certain kind of powdered rock that forms the basis of cement, it gets really hard. And it's very durable. But the scientific people of the world for a long time never guessed seawater because it was too obvious. Sometimes the obvious answer is the right one. But this is part of the Via Egnatia that Paul and Timothy and Silas, maybe Barnabas, traveled on. So this is a piece of the road in the modern world in northern Greece. I don't remember when the picture was taken, but I think it was maybe like 10 years ago or something. So it appears that Luke may have stayed in Philippi because the text switches back to they. He had switched to we and talked about we going to different places for a while, and now he switches back to they, like they went on. It seems like Paul was kind of the lightning rod of criticism, and there's times where he moves ahead of the other people that are part of his group, where he gets sent on ahead because he's a major opposition figure, and someone like Luke probably stayed with some of the members of the church that were there in Philippi. So Paul goes to the synagogue on the Sabbath. Many of you noted rightly that Philippi didn't have one. Remember, Philippi had that place of prayer, and Paul talks to a few women. Here he goes to the synagogue, and we know that he's there for some time because it says he goes to the synagogue on 3 Sabbaths, which means that that's at least 3 weeks. And he has discussions regarding the scriptures. It reports things about the Psalms of David and Isaiah, the suffering servant. These are some of the passages that really point to a Messiah that has to be more than just human. A Messiah that's doing more than just freeing them from the Romans. These are the passages we often hear in the church as we get toward the end of Lent. The suffering servant songs, like a lamb who did not make a sound, like a sheep before the shears, that he took on himself the sins of us all. Those kind of passages seem to be what Paul was digging into. They're certainly part of our liturgy now that we definitely apply to Jesus. I think there's four suffering servant songs in Isaiah, and they start a bit after chapter 40. I think 41 or 42 is the first one, and the last one I think is in the 50s. But if you look at it, if you look at the text of Isaiah, you'll recognize it right away because it's talking about like usual prophetic stuff, and then it talks about the servant of the Lord, and it jumps into that more particular. And the Messiah will rise from the dead. Now this is going to play out very differently in Greece than it does in Palestine to Jewish people. If you remember, it talks about the resurrection from the dead being a stumbling block to the Jews and folly to the Gentiles. It's folly because they don't think it's a very good idea. We'll get to that in just a second, or maybe it's helpful to turn to it now. If you flip to page 120, So Paul in Greece, page 120 in the notes. Paul in Greece is going to encounter a very different world than the Jewish world of Palestine, the Jewish world of the Middle East. So in the Jewish world in the Middle East, the major center of religious life is Jerusalem and the temple, the sacrificial system. The other major center in a local town is the synagogue. It's a culture of the word. It's a more simple, more agrarian culture. It's more oppressed by the Romans. Taxation is high. All of those kind of things. And a lot of Jewish cultural energy centers around religion and worship. Not always good religion and good worship, but religion and worship. In Greece, a lot of the energy is around religion and worship, but it's different because the Greeks are philosophers and poets. Many of the famous thinkers were from Greece. And so there's this academic, intellectual tradition of learning that's different than the context of Palestine. The Greeks were famous for building their cities with an agora, which was a marketplace, a big flat plaza where people would come to sell goods. One of the most famous things that comes from Greece are it's still a big deal, we have them now.
Gyros?
Oh, gyros. That would be a food thing, but not what I'm thinking of.
What's a hint?
Basketball.
Olympics.
The Olympics. The Greeks were famous for their sporting competitions. The Greeks are famous for their studies in perspective. So one of the craziest things, if you want to look at it, is the Parthenon in Athens. Got blown up by Napoleon because he's used it as an ammunition depot, and that's a really dumb thing to do. But if you look at it, it is actually designed in a way that you cannot see as a human person very easily because it manipulates your eyes. So the columns are narrower at the top and they bow a little bit in the middle, and then they get narrower again on the bottom. Anyone know why they do that? Because to the human eye they appear perfectly straight. The floor of the Parthenon is also bowed like that, and because of the structure of our eye and how it works and how we see things, it looks like it's perfectly geometric, but it's not. It's actually, it messes with human perception, and it does it to such a degree that even though most of it is wrecked, this can still happen now. And they did things like the statues on the top appear to be the same size as the statues that are on the bottom, but they're actually twice as big. Because of how you see them and the spatial relationships that our brains construct, they appear to be the same size, but it's because of the angle of light and refraction and all kinds of things and how your eye works. And so there's a genius to Greek design. Like, that's a knowledge of the human person that they don't have in ancient Israel. There's actually a bunch of this that happens throughout, even into medieval Europe. If you look at Gothic cathedrals, they're wrapped in mathematical equations that are really, really fascinating. Like the proportion of the tiers on the facade of Notre Dame is made out of the square roots of 1 and 2 and 3. And I'm sure you recognize that instantly. The Greeks have this principle called the golden mean. And it was sort of the number of perfection. And anyone know what it's based on? The proportion of one thing to another thing that the human finds most beautiful? Anyone know what it's based on? Studies of the average human body. They studied human bodies to the extent that they were able to work out a series of mathematical proportions. And for instance, if you look at Mozart and you combine the tonal qualities of his music, more than half of the time it works out to the same number called the golden mean. It's just a fascinating thing. When you start looking at the math and the intelligence that were behind some of these things, it's very, very different and very, very unexpected. Like homes were designed in proportions that were harmonic, that worked with certain intervals because they were thought of as good, and other intervals were thought of as bad. It turns out that some of the bad ones are the most difficult ones to sing, even today. Like a descending sixth is a very, very difficult interval, even for professional singers to hit consistently, because it doesn't work in our heads very well. You can do an octave, which is 8 pitches, and those pitches actually come from Greek studies of strings. That if you take a string and divide it, if you divide it in half, the pitch goes up an octave. And if you divide the half in half and have a quarter, the pitch goes up another octave. And like all of music and all of the proportions and harmonics between sounds are from Greek geometric studies. But you have to appreciate some of these things, because when you think about it, that's a very different world that Christianity is going to encounter than the world of Judaism, than the world of the temple and synagogues and sacrifices. And so when the message comes there, it has to adapt. How many times in talking about the Greeks have I mentioned Messiah? Never. And so when you look at Paul's preaching to the Greeks, it's not going to be about the same kind of Jewish concepts from the Old Testament and proving that this God of the Old Testament is Jesus Christ. The proofs, the experience of Jesus is different. That Jesus is the creator, that Jesus is the embodiment of goodness, that Jesus is one with God the Father, one in being, consubstantial now. Those are Greek concepts, those are Greek words. And so there's a different flavor to it. The Greek world is dominated by some philosophical schools that we encounter, and they're in the chart. So the most important one is probably Platonism. Plato is one of the great early Greek philosophers. He's one of the most important. Socrates, but we don't have any of Socrates' writings. They all come from Plato. Plato writes Socratic dialogues, and then there's Plato, and then Aristotle. Plato is the author of this sort of distinction between matter and the forms. So there's something that you can see that's material, but there's another thing that you can't see like with your eyes, but you intuit with your mind. That's called the form. So matter and form. And in Plato, the forms, well, in Plato's encounter with early Christianity, the forms themselves, what things are, exist in the mind of God. They're the true nature of things, and that's immaterial. It's in the mind of God, and what we see is just appearance. And that's not a bad thing. Many of the early Christians were Platonic philosophers. So like St. Augustine, if you read his writings, he writes he's a Platonist. And it's not a bad thing. We talk about our body and our soul, and some of this is still the result of Platonism. Is the body good or bad? It's kind of good, right? You would think so. But St. Paul then rails against the desires of the flesh. What's that about? You see, Christianity sits in this kind of uncomfortable nexus of how to deal with these things, because there is a sense where our bodies are created by God and they're designed and they're good, but there's also times like today where Rose Gallagher brings cookies and your brain says, I would like one cookie because Father Keller needs to eat the rest of them. And your body says the cookies are good and so I should have lots. Right? Did that happen to anyone?
Very many.
Yeah, then Father Keller doesn't get very many. But you see that we live in this kind of uncomfortable tension where there is a sense of body bad, soul good. And this can happen in Christianity, that we deny the goodness of the body in order to highlight the goodness of the soul. And it's not really correct. And we've had a strong corrective in the modern world that pushes back against that in a good way, that says, no, your body is good, that the body is created by God in goodness, but some things do get disordered. We have disordered passions, we have disordered emotions. So if you have a really good pizza, lots of us are tempted to keep eating pizza and discover after eating it for a while that we have had too much pizza. Some of you do this same kind of thing with stuff like Brussels sprouts. And I think you're really confused if that's the case. But you see it very strongly when we celebrate a funeral and you look at a person's dead body. And dead bodies look strange, right? Like they're just weird. It's somehow like, this isn't the person that I knew. This isn't who they were. And in one sense, that's true, right? Because it's not the same person that they were. This is a corpse. We use a different word for it. There is a body without a soul. It's dead. And that's a difference. But some of this, you could see that there's possibilities of it where you can use this kind of understanding well. Because sometimes Jesus does talk about denying the desires of your body. Fasting is built on this principle, that you deny yourself good things that you desire in order to strengthen your will, in order to show devotion to God, in order to open yourself to spiritual grace. So there's a way that that's true, but there's a way that you can take it too much to an extreme, that your body is bad. And so the soul is what's important and the annihilation of your body doesn't matter. One of the major critiques of Friedrich Nietzsche, do you know who Friedrich Nietzsche is? Oh, we have a lot of work to do. Friedrich Nietzsche is a philosopher. He would be an early contemporary philosopher, late modern philosopher. His understanding of philosophy is what leads to World War II. He talks about all kinds of stuff. You guys get me into pitfalls all the time. We could talk about the Übermensch and the denial of reality and natures and all kinds of things. I wonder why I thought of him. Oh well, it'll come back. But you see that there is this kind, oh, I remember. It was his critique of Christianity in Germany. Mostly German Lutherans who were like, you just have to live this sober life, you shouldn't laugh, you shouldn't dance, you shouldn't have any hope or any joy because this world is awful and everything's about heaven. And he called them the preachers of death and proclaimed the death of God. But his answer is actually a good one. It's like, if this world is just this horrible slog through the muck, and nothing is good and nothing is holy and everything is about heaven, then why did Jesus come? Like Friedrich Nietzsche is arguing, in fact, against the kind of extreme of this principle of body bad, soul good, this earth bad, heaven good, and that everything becomes about heaven. Stay away from the cookies, Betty Collada. I see you. We got to make you laugh sometimes, right? So Plato is one of the major philosophers of ancient Greece. His follower is named Aristotle. And Plato has a separation between like the intellect and things. Like the forms are different. The forms are in the mind of God. Platonic philosophy actually posits a God that's a bit different than Christianity. Aristotle says the forms are in things, that we're stuck together. And this is the philosophy that the church adopts much more readily. So that a human person is a body and soul composite, that we're stuck together.
I have a question. Back to Nietzsche. Where does he fit with Catholicism?
He doesn't.
I didn't think so. I was wondering how that... Yeah.
What happens in Europe in a lot of cases is the scientific world goes to war with Protestantism. You find this in the debates about evolution. You have the opposition between biblical literalism and scientific knowledge, scientific understanding. And they go to war against each other. And Catholicism sort of looks at it and says that's a dumb war because we're not biblical literalists, we're not fundamentalists. It doesn't work. You can't sustain a fundamentalist argument when you look at the scriptures. It just falls apart. Otherwise, every time you sin, you should be cutting off your hand because Jesus actually said to do that. And most of us would probably have no hands and no feet and no toes, no fingers, no ears, no tongues. Right? There's a way that biblical fundamental literalism doesn't work. And what happens is the intellectual positions is sort of scientific atheism versus fundamentalist Protestantism, and they fight. And Catholicism is in a different place. So Nietzsche... the easiest way to describe what the result of Nietzsche's philosophy is to note that he ended his life in an insane asylum. And so there's points that he makes that are good, but there's a lot of Nietzschean philosophy that isn't. And his understanding can become very broken. But Aristotle has this united form and matter. And think about this because this is where the teaching on the Eucharist comes from, for instance. We believe in transubstantiation. The accidents, the matter remains the same, and the form changes. What it is changes. So it becomes Jesus, but it still looks the same. Tastes like bread, functions like bread, it breaks, it has crumbs, all of those things, but it is really Jesus. In order to do that, you need a philosophical system that works for it. We use Aristotelian metaphysics for that. It was largely baptized by St. Thomas Aquinas in the 1200s. So Plato and Aristotle, you have those two? You're following along? Some of you look kind of starry-eyed. Then we get to some that are going to make a little bit more sense. The Epicureans, you could kind of call them hedonists, although it's a bit of a misnomer, but it makes sense. So the Epicureans say there's no afterlife, everything is random chance. You are here today because a bird pooped on a dinosaur. And because of that, the dinosaur fell on the butterfly, which on and on and on and on, and random chance until you came out. That's Epicureanism. So there's no point in longing for an afterlife. There's no point in anything beyond this world because it's all just random anyway, and what you do doesn't make a difference. So your whole goal in life is to do as well as you can with the time you have. To get as much enjoyment as you can and as little pain as you can, and then that's it, and you're like candle smoke in the wind, and gone, and that's the end. So those are the Epicureans. They want to free people from widespread dread and fate. Oh, we're going to have to talk about Greek religion too. Darn it. So the Epicureans, they're not straight hedonists like you should, do inordinate amounts of immoral things because it doesn't matter because pleasure is the only good. That's taking it too far. They do believe in morality, but it's a strange kind of morality because there's no afterlife. Part of it is they also react against this Greek idea that gods intervene in the lives of people. We could say the second piece that we should talk about, this isn't in the notes, so I apologize, is Greek religion. Greek pagan religion is very fatalistic, and it's kind of strange to us. So the gods were worshipped with various things. Some of it was sexual, and you would go sleep with temple prostitutes. Some of it was offering these food offerings and different things, and there were idols. Some of them look very nice. They were in temples, like the temple of Athena Nike, Athena the Conqueror, in Athens. She, I think, was... what was it, a 20 or 30 foot statue that was solid gold? Like solid gold and marble. I mean, this wasn't a minor industrial thing. Like, that would probably be one of the most beautiful things you would see in your life. But what happens is, if you really want to know, have you heard of the kids show Hercules? Like the old Disney movie years ago? And they have these three sisters and this like string of fate, and they try to cut it and it doesn't work because Hercules becomes a god again. That kind of thing. Greek religion is fatalistic, which means your life is determined by fate. You're sort of set in motion from the beginning, and nothing you do matters. If you're poor, it's your fate. If you're rich, it's your fate. If bad things happen to you, it's your fate. Or it could be because the gods got angry with you. So the stories about the Greek gods are filled with them becoming jealous of each other and mad at the world, and so then they do things that are unkind. Like Zeus, and I think it's Hera. Is Hera Zeus's wife? I think so. Zeus and Hera, like they get into a fight, and so Hera turns a bunch of people on an island that worship Zeus into ants. And then they all get stepped on and die. And I mean, the stories are like that. Like the gods are just sort of whimsical, and they intervene in human affairs all the time. And it's just, sort of like irresponsible teenage middle schoolers who are like, how can I cause chaos today? Well, I'm going to turn this person into a frog. So the Epicureans react against that. The gods don't care about you. They don't intervene in everyday life. It doesn't matter. That's not what gods are. And it sounds weird to us, but you have to remember that in the Greek world, explanations of things are hard. So Zeus is the god of thunder and storms. They make gods often out of things that are powerful and they don't understand. Who's the god of the sea? Neptune. I was thinking of Poseidon. Poseidon and his trident. Neptune, I think, is something else. Anyway.